My father is a photographer, so that's where I learned about photography. And I realized early on I didn't think I liked it. It was like a job. But as I left, to live on my own, that's when I started to take it seriously and realize actually this is pretty cool and it is an art form. Because he was doing more like advertising photography and I was doing like painting. I was doing like the real artist thing, drawings, rendering. I realized when I look back on some of my earlier sketchbooks, they were drawings that wanted to be photographs. I would spend hours on end trying to render like a couch corner or something like that. And it would have been so much faster just to take a picture of it would have been probably better. I think wet chemical photography allows this kind of the chance operations. If you get the chemistry slightly wrong, you get a new result. And I think those little windows of experimentation are interesting to me. And I like that relationship, and sometimes I feel like it loses something once it's translated to zeros and ones. And I think wet chemical photography allows the thing to move and develop in more unexpected ways. The portraiture series is a salted paper prints where I wanted to investigate portraiture, and thinking about this kind of responsibility of image making, I thought somehow I need to incorporate them into the process. So I learned about the salted paper printing technique, and that's where I started to take some of their body fluids and use their fluids as the content to produce their own image as a way to sort of include their soul. So it was very much about the subject's index into the image that started the catalyst for materials and using the materials from the subject into the process. So it was really much about trying to be true to the subject. I think it really started when I moved back to LA. I was hanging out with my friend, and he recently broke up with his girlfriend. And it was the first time where I was studying photography officially and thinking about the history of photography. I was learning about salted paper printing. So at that point I was like using table salts, and my friend was crying, and at the whole time I'm trying to console him, I'm like kind of happy because I'm like, oh my God, let me have some of those tears. It really recorded that moment of a crying friend incorporating his tears. And then I started to establish more relationships with friends, and by asking them to trust me, I can get their fluid and hopefully do it justice. I mean, I do a lot of these things on a personal level because it's a way to psychologically digest. For instance, I had a friend she was dating a bunch of different guys at the time, and she also wanted to be a model. So I was like, I'll do your headshots if you give me the saliva of these different guys you're dating. What I love about that series is there's a story to each picture. Most every picture that I make, there's a story behind it and a reason for all those decisions to be made. The Gaps was a series of pictures that I took behind the Hollywood sign, where I photographed the back of the Hollywood sign. So it was very much like an image of the construction and the construct of these letters. But then they were printed on bubble wrap with hair dye as the pigment, the CMYK structure. For me, it was just experimenting with these materials of bubble wrap and hair dye, but also it was this sort of idea of this inflated image, and realized that this image is just a big bubble that could change at any moment. It's inflated. And I think living in LA and just realizing how much work is involved to make an image and the production of image making and the value of images in general and the value people put on that. At one point when I did have my studio in Hollywood, it felt really silly to say I make images in Hollywood, but I love that kind of cliche at the same time too. I would say Night Sky definitely relates to LA. The first time I showed it was at a Paris photo, the first one in LA at the Paramount Studios, and I thought it was like the perfect place for this cocaine on black velvet series, because if it's going to work anywhere, it's going to work in Hollywood, and I kind of didn't expect it to work anywhere else because it sounded so over the top, and I don't know, something made sense to show that work in Hollywood. So I think it very much developed out of this Hollywood experience. For me, that project Night Skies was also about equating the art selling practice, the gallery dealers with the drug dealers, and the price points and demand and all these aspects of it kind of was interesting to me. And I thought it would just be fun to try to see if the gallery could sell cocaine. The Burnout series really stemmed from learning about this process of, it's called the burnout process, the Devore process, where they use acid to erode the organic matters of the prints. And I love this idea of negative space, and it was very much working with that. But I also like this idea of working with acid and how acid could erase an image. And it was a further way to degrade an image. I think when I showed that work, it was a show that I did at the Hollywood Gallery, an M&B gallery, and I showed images of the gallery dealers. They were their own burnouts, so I would have the director, the owners, the people that worked there. And I think being in Hollywood, the term burnout was like a very intense term. People were like, you come here and you burn out. Torsos, for me, it became about representation of people, but it focused on their clothes, so it was another sort of reference to fabric. But also I didn't want the direct signifier of the face as a portrait. So for me it was a kind of portrait, but in a way to see the way that their hands gestured, or sometimes people put the hand on the waist, as another way of creating a portrait of somebody. The project Bridges Over Flint, I think Flint, Michigan was just all over the media headlines, and everybody was talking about this polluted waters of Flint. And at the time I was also very interested in how this water could be imbued with so much meaning and politicized, and I love the baggage and meaning that just happened in this water, this tap water. So I decided to go there and see what I can make with the water. I went with my 35mm camera and just like black and white film, and photographed all the bridges that go over the Flint River. And then I used the tap water and I concocted a little cocktail that could develop the silver film. You know, silver film actually is quite easy to develop. There's a lot of different things that you could use to develop silver film, but so I knew that there's some elements that I could do, so it was a little bit of testing involved. I would say Bridges Over Flint is probably the most political piece that I made, but I knew it was something that was there, and it was, you know, working with this sort of subject is a bit of a tightrope that I was interested to work with. I did kind of want to make something a little bit more timeless than just sort of the media story that gets brushed over. Stepping Stone Falls fit because I happened to be in Flint, Michigan, and I did visit the mouth of the Flint River is this place called Stepping Stone Falls, and essentially it's a dam, man-made structure that creates this waterfall, but it has this very strange brutalistic architecture, and it just seemed very mechanical and Detroit, and it was very clunky, and I just thought it was a very beautiful site, and it sort of fit in with this other project that I did of waterfalls. "1864" was a project that was specific to a show that I did in Atlanta, Georgia. And I knew I wanted to make a work that involved Georgia. So I started to get into looking at Civil War photographs that George Barnard took in Atlanta when it was basically taken over by Sherman's army. Because, you know, in thinking about him going out there with his wagon during a war, you know, it's kind of an intense, beautiful thing that I was interested in, and for me it was also about this mirroring effect of presenting Atlanta for Atlanta, and so they were album imprints, and I made them album imprint process in a lot of ways was because that's how George Barnard would have printed. With this process that he would print them, it's pretty much egg whites and silver nitrate on paper, so I decided to throw in the ingredients for peach pie into the mix. So it's peaches, salt, sugar, cinnamon, flour. Obviously eggs is a main component. It seemed to make sense to make some peach pies for Georgia. For me, it was about the destruction of Atlanta, and it was war-torn Atlanta, and it was during the Civil War, which was very much about race, you know? And I feel like that was the subject, and I think that that's what made me love Atlanta, because it came through that struggle, and I think why it's very progressive and a really super interesting city, and I think has a really nuanced, and they've approached racism with a serious understanding, and I feel like they are kind of smart about it. I emphasize the sky because I wanted a focus where George Barnard's marks were mostly visible because for me it was about trying to get as close as maybe minimalist painting as possible. So it's the site for projections and the site where you can think about something and you're not harnessed to that direct indexical visual thing of bombed out building or bullet marks. I think working with a lot of these historical processes or like rekindling old past modes of photography is something that I keep doing in a lot of ways because I realize that I have an interesting idea, but someone almost did the similar thing back in the day in the early 1900s, and I realized, oh, if they did it, I might as well just study them and see where they made to a certain point and where I can extend that. Entropy, corrosion, destruction, degradation. All these aspects or descriptions is something that happens naturally to everything all the time. And why not just work with what the world gives you? And I feel like that's a natural thing, and why try to change it? I think the look of degradation is appealing because it sort of reminds you of the fact that it all does degrade over some time. And I think looking at something degraded may make you think about, okay, I need to appreciate the now. And there's something appealing to me when looking at that and working with that, because there's a existential thing that happens when you see something decayed and broken. I'm not trying to create this pathos all the time, but I think there is positivity to be seen in that. And I think you can replenish yourself with that. Vatnajökull is actually the second largest glacier in Europe, and it sits on Iceland. And it's actually the glacier that breaks off that makes these icebergs roll into this bay called Jökulsárlón. Like, I went there as it was my first assignment as a photographer, and I learned more about the sort of geothermal aspects that makes the Icelandic landscape so beautiful, because they're just volcanic activity, and that constant movement I think makes this beautiful landscape. So that sort of influenced me to burn a lot of these pictures and work with this heating element. And also that work is an extension to a further investigation into chromogenic printing, like treated with different elements that I've done previously. Because I do love sea prints, and I noticed that I continue to make them. And I first started making them with the lakes and reservoirs where I'd soak the sea prints in the water. And for me, that project was about the soon obsolescence of that material. And then I noticed I could still make them, so I might as well include earth and bury some images in Hawaii underground and see what the earth does to these pictures. So it's just this constant abuse of these sea printing material, I think, is a theme that seems to be going more and more. So this is where fire is introduced to sea prints, and then seeing what fire could do. I just started heat treating these pictures, and what's interesting about the chromogenic process is just emulsion. So it kind of has an elasticity, so it bubbles up, it cracks, it punctures, it does a lot of weird, unexpected things that I was sort of playing around with in the process. And also it physically deteriorates the prints. It makes it very undulaty and crinkles, and trying to work with that was a part of the process too, because the prints themselves develop their own topography. It becomes this sort of landscape of bubbles and mountains and tiny little blisters and cracks, and you see the wrinkles. The color actually comes from a process of photographing the images of the iceberg in different stages. I thought it was like a filmic process, because I would do a burn on the print, I would photograph it, then burn it again, and photograph it and burn it again. So I'd have essentially pictures of this slow burning process, so the print was getting more and more deteriorated. And then I would take those separate images and then separate them in cyan, yellow, magenta, and then sandwich them back together to get that sort of psychedelic prismatic effect. And then it goes through another process of burning, which gives it even more of a psychedelic printing. So it was just sort of riffing off of this color action that happens. And I think that psychedelic color flamboyantness also, I felt like, was appropriate to the subject, because it's really sad to look at melted icebergs, and it was a subject that I knew was kind of macabre, so it was a way to balance that out and show that there can be an optimism. I think that also in these giant shapes, especially when they're vertical, one naturally just like anthropomorphizes them and looks, oh, it looks like a face, an arm, a sculpture. And I think I'm interested in those projections that happen, but also they're just giant, beautiful forms that, nature made, and I'm just honestly just recording them. In terms of the hallucinatory visual aspect of the work, yeah, they are hallucinogenic. Drugs operate in an interesting way to, they tinker with different things to make you see a different way. A lot like you can do that with the digital camera. You can mess with the chips and all of a sudden it sees a certain way. And I look at it as a similar practice. I think combining fire and ice as these two opposing elements seemed to be a logical thing to do for the project. I mean, I was worried it would be a little too obvious because it could step on these sort of it could just be cheesy. But I think that it was important to do that because I think for me, my mom's very much Buddhist, and I feel like I grew up with these values that one thing leads to another. And I think that kind of harmonizing aspect infuses a lot of what I do in my practice. So I think representing these two different yin-yang ideas is always fun to throw in there if I can.